Welcome, my friends. Today I'm going to narrate some conspiracy theories to help you fall asleep. But first, please like and subscribe to the channel. Also, comment down below where you're watching from. Thanks. I was just a geologist sent to log soil data outside Kuiperowitz Plateau. Nothing unusual, nothing complicated, until the drill refused to go any deeper. At 20 feet it stopped cold, like it had struck something that didn't belong. Beneath, the dirt wasn't rock, or fossil, or pipe. It was glassy, curved, and too precise. When I cleared the soil by hand, I uncovered the first step. Perfectly cut, leading down. No record of it on any map, no mention in any report. That was the moment.
I stopped thinking like a scientist.
Because if it had been built, someone had buried it, and they hadn't planned for it to be found again. I was just supposed to catalogue soil samples. That's it. In and out. The job was a quiet one. Seasonal contract work for a survey firm, hired by a mining company in western Utah. They wanted to know if the shale bed near the Kuiperowitz Plateau held anything worth digging for. I liked the solitude. The days were long, dry, and silent, save for the hum of my equipment and the occasional distant rumble of a truck hauling core samples back to base camp. Most days were uneventful. I'd mark coordinates, take seismic readings, and note mineral density. It was honest work. But on the 12th day, just after lunch, the probe refused to descend past a certain depth. At first I thought it had hit a boulder, but when I tried again it dropped 6 more inches, then stopped.
Hard.
I pulled it up and checked the camera. There was light reflecting back, unnaturally sharp, like glass. Beneath it, shadow, perfect and symmetrical. That didn't make sense. Rock doesn't reflect light like that. I moved the scanner to a different
Angle and tried again. Same result. A crisp edge at a depth of about 20 feet, with what looked like a deliberate gap between soil layers.
I didn't say anything on the team channel. Didn't want to sound like I was chasing shadows. But something about the formation kept gnawing at me. That night, while backing up field data, I isolated the footage and enhanced it. The outline became clearer. A smooth curve descending at a shallow angle, too clean for erosion. I slept poorly, dreaming of dark corridors under the desert floor. The next morning, I returned alone, told the team I needed to double-check a fault line. I brought a hand auger this time. After 10 minutes, the blade slipped through with no resistance. Beneath the layer of compacted clay was a hollow space, and carved into the side of it, partially obscured by time and sediment, were steps. I didn't tell anyone about the stairs. Not yet. Instead, I flagged the site for structural instability and requested it be marked off until further survey. That gave me time. I spent the next few days combing through topographic data and historical maps trying to make sense of what I'd found. Nothing about the area hinted at previous development. No records of settlements, no known mining shafts, not even folklore. But the more I looked, the more the terrain revealed subtle inconsistencies. Satellite imagery from the 1970s showed a heat signature, faint but distinct, centered on the exact location of the stairwell. In more recent scans, the signature had vanished, like something had cooled or shut down. I pulled records from geological studies archived by the Bureau of Land Management. Most were dry summaries of mineral content and sediment layering. But a 1993 report caught my eye. It mentioned non-organic formations inconsistent with surrounding strata, discovered during a shallow core drill. No further explanation, no follow-up. Just a highlighted note, potential anomaly, no action taken. I found the author, a retired geologist named Eleanor Pabes, now living 2 states away. I sent her a message under the pretense of a grad student researching old surveys. Her response was immediate and brief. Meet me in person, not over the phone. I drove to Arizona the next day. Her house was modest, buried in a cul-de-sac that felt forgotten. Eleanor was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and cautious. She didn't invite me in, just stood at the door and listened as I described what I'd found. When I mentioned the stairs, she went still. Then she nodded once and stepped aside. Her living room was filled with boxes, paper records, maps, and reels of analog footage. She pulled out a folder marked 1993 West Kaiparowitz. Inside were photographs I hadn't expected, clear images of the same type of carved stone steps leading into the earth. Not at my site, but a ridge 10 miles west. We sealed it, she said quietly. Didn't dig further. Too many questions, not enough answers. But you're not the first to find one. And you won't be the last. I stayed in Eleanor's guest room that night. She insisted. Said it wasn't safe to drive back through the canyon after dark. Over tea, she told me everything she remembered. Quietly, like someone might still be listening. Back in '93, her team had been contracted by a private foundation claiming to research groundwater patterns. She figured out pretty quickly that wasn't true. The client provided their own equipment and filtered every report through an off-site liaison. When the core sample pulled up an angular cavity, they were told to abandon the location. No explanation, just a full halt. But Eleanor kept copies, photos, seismic maps, even internal memos. Some of the documents were partially blacked out, but one phrase kept showing up. Subterranean architecture, non-anthropogenic, not man-made. And the samples confirmed it. The stone from the steps wasn't native to the region. High density, composite with microstratification, too uniform to occur naturally. Not concrete, not volcanic, something engineered. She showed me a cross-section analysis dated March 12, 1993. The material had embedded particles that aligned magnetically when exposed to current. It wasn't just built, it was designed to react. Eleanor tried to get a second opinion from a colleague at a university lab. 3 days later, her contact called to say the samples had been lost in transit. Then he stopped answering her calls. That's when she walked away from the profession. Some things, she said, aren't meant to be uncovered by people like us. The next morning, I returned to my site before sunrise, carrying a small fiber optic scope, a portable scanner, and 2 battery-powered lights. I unsealed the flagged area and lowered myself in. The soil was loose around the opening, like it had been disturbed before. The stairs were cleaner than they should have been. No moss, no debris, just layers of fine sediment that brushed away like dust from glass. As I descended, the air grew cooler, denser and unnaturally still. 10 steps. Down, my scanner stopped working. 15 steps. and the light began to dim. Not from battery loss, but as if the walls were pulling it in. At the base was a landing, and beyond it, an archway, perfectly intact. The doorway was framed by markings, not letters, not symbols, but depressions in the stone that followed a mathematical sequence. I didn't recognize it at the time, but I'd seen enough to know this wasn't a tomb, it was a boundary. The passage beyond the arch was narrow and cold, and every sound I made came back to me wrong, flattened, like the air itself was absorbing the echo. The walls were the same dark composite material, smooth to the touch but slightly warm, as if retaining some kind of residual energy. I moved slowly, sweeping the beam of my flashlight across the corridor. There were no carvings, no signs of life, just the rhythmic indentations that ran along the base of each wall, grooves that looked like they might once have held cables or some kind of rail. After 30 feet, the corridor opened into a chamber. That stopped me in my tracks. It was a dome, roughly 40 feet high, perfectly spherical, with a floor so reflective it gave the illusion of water, though it was dry and solid beneath my boots. In the center stood a low plinth, waist height, made from the same material, but embedded with faint blue lights that shimmered beneath the surface. I circled it, keeping my distance, and noticed the lights pulsed in time with my footsteps. Not constantly, only when I moved. I set down the scanner, though I knew it wouldn't work. Predictably, it flickered and died. I pulled out my phone to take a video, but it refused to focus. The image blurred at the edges, and a low-frequency hum began to build in my ears, like a pressure I couldn't escape. I backed out of the chamber, heart racing, breath shallow. The moment I crossed the threshold into the corridor, the sensation vanished. I sat down against the wall and tried to collect myself. That's when I noticed something strange. Faint impressions in the dust along the floor. Not footprints, not exactly. More like drag marks in sets of 3, spaced unevenly, heading in both directions from the dome. I followed one set back toward a side tunnel I hadn't noticed before. This one was shorter, leading to a sealed door. Same composite material, but covered in what looked like corrosion. Around the edges I could see faint grooves like a gear system, recessed and silent. I pressed my palm to the center. Nothing happened, but then I stepped back and aimed my flashlight at the base of the door. And that's when I saw it, a shallow emblem, perfectly symmetrical, shaped like a tree with its roots pointing upward. It was carved not into the surface, but within it, suspended beneath the outer layer like an image behind glass. And that's when the thought finally came. This wasn't a ruin. This place had never broken down. It had been sealed. I didn't go back the next day. I told myself I needed time to review what I'd found to figure out what the hell I was even looking at. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid. Something about that place, the silence, the way light behaved differently, the pressure in the air had followed me back. Even standing outside in open daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still underground. That night, I compiled everything. Footage, partial scans, audio logs, hand-drawn sketches. I encrypted the files and backed them up to a private drive. I kept disconnected from the internet. Then I wrote a long email. Not to my employer, but to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Dr. Jared Knox, a former professor who'd left academia after publishing a controversial paper on lost terrestrial structures. He was laughed out of his department, but I remembered his theories. He believed certain land formations were evidence not of erosion or tectonic shifts, but of something intentional, something built and buried. I sent him everything, no explanation, just a message. Tell me I'm wrong. 2 hours later, he replied with a single line. Where did you find this? The next morning, I noticed a black SUV parked outside the motel I was using as my base. It didn't move for 4 hours. I switched rooms that night, paid cash, and left my phone behind. That's when I started noticing the patterns. My email account locked me out, claiming a password reset I hadn't requested. My encrypted drive showed signs of a remote access attempt despite being offline the day before. And Knox? Gone. His contact info wiped from the university's directory. No reply to any message I sent after that first one. I called his office. Disconnected. I tried to shake it off. Coincidence, paranoia, but I knew better. Someone had seen what I'd found. I drove back to the site under cover of darkness, parked half a mile out, and approached on foot. The flagged markers I'd left were gone. In their place were tire tracks, deep, fresh, heavy, like a transport vehicle had been through. I ran the last 100 yards, slid down the embankment, and reached the spot where the stairwell should have been. What I found was a fresh layer of compacted soil, smoothed by machine. No opening. No trace of disturbance. They had buried it again. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the sound of soil being poured over stone, the mechanical hum of a backhoe smoothing away the truth. I knew I had one chance left, a lead I hadn't followed, an old mining tunnel that cut beneath the ridge from the east. It had been closed for decades, but if I could reach it, I might find a way back into the chamber without drawing attention. At first light, I packed what I needed: flashlights, spare batteries, water, a coil of rope, and a bolt cutter I bought from a hardware store 2 towns over. I didn't bring a phone. Instead, I printed a note and sealed it in an envelope, leaving it with a friend in a city 5 hours away, along with a simple instruction. If I didn't return in 3 days, send it to every geologist, historian, and investigative reporter on the list. It wasn't a plan, not really, but it made the risk feel real enough to commit. The mine entrance was hidden behind brush and loose rock, just like the locals had said. The padlock was rusted, but held firm until I snapped it with the cutter. Inside, the air was dry and sharp, metallic, like it hadn't moved in years. I followed the main shaft, ignoring the splinter tunnels, watching for signs, tool marks too recent, footprints, any indication someone else had found this path. I saw none. After nearly an hour, I found the breach. A ragged split in the rock, wall barely wide enough to squeeze through. On the other side, the smooth walls began again, the same dark material, the same silence. I was back inside. The dome chamber was unchanged, but the plinth in the center was no longer dormant. The lights were active, rotating in a pattern like a signal waiting for a reply. And this time, the scanner worked. Just once, it captured a single data point before shorting out, but it was enough. Temperature, -16 degrees Celsius. internal structure hollow, depth undetermined. That meant it was still open, still drawing energy. I moved closer, step by step, until I stood beside the plinth. I reached out, hesitated, then touched the surface with my fingertips. It responded instantly. The lights brightened, and a shape began to form beneath the floor, lines of faint illumination sketching a cityscape in 3 dimensions, suspended like a blueprint hovering in dust. Towers, roads, structures laid out with impossible precision. And at the edge of the map, something I hadn't expected. A trajectory. A path. Not underground, but upward, into the sky. I didn't try to go deeper. I don't think I could have if I wanted to. The city beneath the floor, the projection, faded after less than a minute, its lines dissolving into a haze like morning fog burning off at sunrise. When it was gone, the plinth went dark again, and the chamber returned to silence. I stood there for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just listening. But there was nothing. No hum, no vibration, no sign of whatever force had made itself known. Eventually, I made my way back through the breach and out of the mine, blinking against the light of the late afternoon sun. I half expected someone to be waiting for me, a truck, another team, maybe even someone official, but the hillside was empty. No fresh tire tracks, no footprints, not even birdsong, just the wind moving through the sagebrush like it always had. I drove to the nearest town, found a payphone, and called my friend. I told her to hold the envelope, that I was fine, that I'd explain later. I never did. Instead, I took the long road home, stopping at motels that didn't ask questions, sleeping with the lights on, jumping at every knock on the wall. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing happened. No follow-up, no warning, no strange men in suits. Just silence. I kept waiting for someone to erase what I knew, but it never came. What did come, slowly, was understanding. The city hadn't been buried by disaster. It had been hidden, sealed with intent. And the trajectory on the map hadn't been an evacuation route. It had been a departure, a launch path. Whatever civilization built that place, they didn't die off. They left. The stairs I found weren't an entrance. They were an anchor point. A way home if they ever needed to return. And maybe that's what the energy pulse was. A signal, not a message to us, but to them. An alert that something had been opened. I don't know if they're coming back. I'm not even sure I want to know. What I do know is that I've never looked at the night sky the same way again. Not as a ceiling, but as a door. And some nights, when everything is still, I swear I can feel the ground beneath me holding its breath. There's a landmass in the 1982 satellite records that shouldn't be there. And then, just like that, it's gone. I wasn't supposed to be the one to find it. I was working nights as a contract technician at a university archive lab in Toronto, digitizing old weather satellite footage for a private research grant. The hours were long, and the work was mostly mindless, frame-by-frame calibration, enhancement, and tagging. Most of the material came from obsolete NOAA satellites, grainy infrared scans from the late 70s through early 90s, Nobody really looked at this stuff anymore, that's why they gave it to us. It was just me, a bank of silent terminals, and a rotating playlist of ambient tracks on low volume. Then one shift, I queued up an automated batch for quality check and stepped away to make tea. I came back to find the screen stuck on a frame from June 3rd, 1982, full polar pass, southern hemisphere. But what caught my eye wasn't the usual cloud activity, it was something else. Just west of the Drake Passage, nestled in a blank zone, typically obscured by cloud bands, was a shadow. Not a weather formation, a structure. It looked like a coastline, jagged, defined, almost like the edge of a continent. I thought it was an artifact, maybe a stitch error. So I scrubbed the pass. Reran the calibration, same result. I pulled the metadata, no anomalies, but the location didn't match any known landmass, not even a submerged one. Just the ocean. I flagged the file, ran a second scan, then logged it for supervisor review. But the next day, when I tried to pull it again, the file had been replaced. Same timestamp, same satellite ID. But now the frame showed nothing, just clouds. I checked the log. My flag had been deleted, access history wiped. When I asked about it casually over lunch, my supervisor looked confused. "You sure you weren't looking at a glitch?" he asked. Old data gets weird sometimes.
I wanted to believe him, I really did. But that shape, coastal, detailed, almost angular, it had been too precise to ignore.
And it was only after I started digging through the raw dumps manually that I noticed something even stranger. That formation, whatever it was, only appeared in data from a single week. June 1st to June 7th. Every 26 years, the satellite made the same orbital pass. And in the June frames from 1956, there it was again. Faint, but unmistakable. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I didn't even trust my own memory at first. For the next few nights, I returned to the lab after hours and combed through archived satellite captures manually, bypassing the standard viewer and digging into the raw telemetry files stored on tape drives barely anyone knew how to use anymore. The 1982 data was gone from the university servers, overwritten or replaced with generic cloud imagery. But I found a redundancy archive, something labeled internal QA assets, buried on an old offsite server we weren't supposed to touch. No password, just a red warning label and a note that said migration pending. Inside were dozens of raw scans from the same orbital path, and on 3 of them the landmass was there again. It had edges, texture, even elevation contours. It wasn't a smear or cloud reflection. It looked real. I downloaded copies to an encrypted thumb drive and started checking older satellite paths. 1956, 2008. Same week, same coordinates, same shadow, 7 days of visibility. Then nothing, like it had never been there. It didn't make any geological sense. Continents don't just appear and disappear like mirages. I started looking into the satellite programs themselves. No AA, early NASA missions, even declassified military reconnaissance. Imagery, most of it was scrubbed clean or conveniently missing the window I needed. But there was a pattern forming. Every 26 years the anomaly appeared near the Southern Ocean, centered roughly along a corridor between the South Shetland Islands and an unregistered patch of open sea. And each time it was visible only in infrared, never in visible light. That's when I found the name. Not in a satellite archive, but in a forum for amateur satellite collectors. A user with a dead account had posted a single thread in 2009. The subject line just read, June anomalies SH26Y cycle. Inside was a string of frame captures, most of them corrupted, and a set of coordinates that matched mine exactly. The account was linked to a man named Renzo Faber, a retired geophysicist from Uruguay who had worked on seismic mapping contracts for private drilling firms in the 80s. I tried finding him. His email bounced back. No social presence, no academic. Records past 1991. I dug deeper, found an archived newsletter from a short-lived maritime research journal. In it, Faber described a transient shelf structure south of Cape Horn that he claimed to have tracked using modified sonar arrays, only to have his equipment confiscated by what he called contracted authorities. The article was never cited again. And, less than a year later, the publication folded without explanation. I knew then that this wasn't about sensor glitches. Someone else had seen it too, and they had been silenced. I started building a timeline, something I could hold on to make sense of the pattern. 1956, 1982, 2008, always the first week of June, always in the same spectral range, thermal infrared, low orbit passes. It didn't matter which satellite, which agency, or which hemisphere launched it from. The anomaly showed up in any platform, with the right angle and resolution, and then disappeared entirely from all subsequent frames. I plotted the coordinates onto a flat Mercator grid and noticed something subtle. Each appearance drifted slightly westward by a few kilometers, as if the land mass itself wasn't fixed, but tethered to something deeper, maybe tectonic, maybe not. That part scared me more than anything. If it wasn't a structure or an island, but something moving, then we weren't just dealing with a location, we were dealing with a mechanism. I pulled old naval records from international archives, some scanned, some typed, all forgotten. In June of 1982, a Chilean patrol ship reported strange sonar returns and a sudden compass failure while passing through the same corridor. The event was logged as a magnetic anomaly, and their charts were updated with a no navigation warning. In 1956, a British expedition en route to Antarctica filed a radio distress call before vanishing near the same sector. No debris was ever recovered. It was listed as an open case, adverse weather conditions cited as the likely cause, but their last known position matched my map to within a mile. The deeper I looked, the more I found hints of erasure. Government charts with blank patches, research vessels listed as decommissioned within days of recording abnormal data. Seismographic reports redacted without explanation. There was no whistleblower, no leaked memo, no smoking gun. Just a long, quiet trail of missing context. And then I found something I shouldn't have, an internal NOAA training slide buried in a cached web archive. The file was labeled Contingency Coordinates S86 Protocol. The slide showed the same southern corridor, overlaid with hazard warnings and an annotation I'll never forget. Visibility window, 7-day cycle, 26-year phase, absolute non-engagement. I stared at that phrase for what felt like an hour. Absolute non-engagement. It wasn't just known. It was actively ignored, buried, suppressed. The sixth continent, whatever it was, had been logged, mapped, and quarantined decades ago, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure the world forgot. I booked a flight to Punta, arenas using cash and a false name pulled from an old offshore account I'd set up during a brief stint in contract work down in Santiago. I told no one where I was going, left my personal devices behind, and carried only a cheap burner phone and a waterproof field notebook. The southern coast of Chile was where Faber had last been tracked, and I needed more than online clues. I needed paper trails, physical evidence, something that couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. I started with maritime archives, small ones kept in municipal buildings that looked more like storage sheds than government offices. Most were digitized now, but a few dusty ledgers remained, handwritten logs of sea routes, sonar pings, fuel usage, small details no one had bothered to sanitize. In a 1982 ledger from a private oceanographic outfit, I found a route marked Faber Group, Test Path, S Corridor. The line stopped abruptly 5 days in with no return route listed. The only note in the margin read, "Crew diverted."
By instruction. No one at the office could tell me who had given the order.
"It came from above," one clerk said without even looking up. I followed the thread further, down to an old equipment depot Faber was rumoured to have used for calibrating his modified sonar arrays. It had long been decommissioned, the doors chained and rusted, the roof half collapsed. But inside, beneath years of dust and mildew, were pieces of something he left behind. 2 waterproof Pelican cases, one shattered from moisture damage, the other intact. Inside were handwritten notes, reel-to-reel tapes, and a contact sheet of infrared captures that hadn't degraded with time. The captures were dated June 6, 1982, and the shape was there again, clearer than I'd ever seen it. A jagged stretch of coastline with visible ridges, interior shadowing, and what looked like symmetrical indentations, almost like structures. I should have left then, but I didn't. Instead, I played one of the tapes using a backup reel-to-digital converter
From my pack.
The recording began with static, followed by a man's voice, shaky, panicked. "We found it. It's not land. It's not land. It rose up under us." The tape was cut off. A time code flickered, then restarted. The voice again, quieter this time. "It sees infrared. It doesn't want to be found." I shut the tape off, packed everything, and left that place before nightfall. As I locked the gate behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the building wasn't as empty as it looked. That something had been watching just outside the corners of the light, waiting for me to stay longer than I should. I flew back through Buenos Aires under another name and routed myself north with stopovers long enough to check for tails. It was a habit I hadn't needed in years, one I hoped I'd never have to use again. But now it felt necessary. I had physical evidence, photos, voice recordings, sonar logs, even a partial scan of the anomaly itself. And the weight of that proof made every glance, every unexpected noise feel like surveillance. Back in my flat, I kept the curtains drawn and ran my laptop on an isolated air-gapped system. I started preparing a drop, scanning, backing up, encrypting, cataloguing everything into secure vaults across multiple dead man switches. If
I vanished, at least the material would live. But the question hung over everything. Who do you trust with something like this? I wasn't a journalist, I wasn't a scientist. I was just the one who'd followed the trail far enough to get burned.
I reached out to a contact from my university days, someone who used to run in open data circles and had since gone quiet. We met in a cafe with no cameras, and I watched her arrive from across the street before stepping in. She listened as I laid it out, no drama, just facts. When I slid the infrared captures across the table, she didn't speak, just stared. Then she asked the question I hadn't let myself say out loud. "Do you think it's artificial?" I didn't answer, not directly. I just showed her the sonar contours from 1982 and the repeated symmetry. She looked up, and her face was pale. This kind of thing doesn't get buried by accident. We agreed on a timed release protocol, 72
hours. She'd go dark and prepare a secure upload that would activate if I failed to check in. That night, I noticed a small red dot flicker across my living room window before vanishing.
The next day, my apartment building's fire alarm went off at 3:43 a.m. and 3 floors were evacuated without explanation. I never found the source. I moved locations. Again. On my way out, I passed a white sedan parked across from the front. Steps. Same one I'd seen 2 nights before. Same dent in the front bumper. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look back. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about discovery. It was containment. Not of knowledge, but of people. Everyone who'd gotten too close to this thing had either disappeared, gone, silent, or changed directions entirely. If I released what I had, even anonymously, I wouldn't just be a leaker. I'd be a target. And the truth was, I didn't know what was more dangerous, the thing in the ocean or the ones keeping it.
Secret. I didn't sleep the night before the drop. I watched the clock instead, counting down the final 12 hours of my life as I knew it.
My contact had set everything in motion. The data packets were queued, encrypted, and loaded onto multiple dead drop sites with distributed release timers. All I had to do was wait. But when dawn came, the connection failed. Not corrupted, wiped. My secure backups, my decoys, even my redundant vaults, hosted on offline drives, were suddenly inaccessible. One after another, error messages stacked like a slow, methodical erasure. Someone had reached in and shut it all down. I packed what I could and ran, not in panic, but with a clarity I hadn't felt before. It was over. They knew. I made it as far as Valparaiso before I saw the first shadow that didn't belong. A man seated 3 rows back on a nearly empty bus, reading the same page for 3 hours. At the terminal, I spotted another figure loitering near the lockers, the same face I'd seen in a cafe in Ushuaia a week earlier. No movement, just presence. I ditched the station and took the side streets to a short-term hostel that didn't ask for ID. Inside, I tried the tapes again, the ones from Faber's
case. They still played.
This time, I listened to the last file, one I hadn't touched yet, because it was labelled with nothing but a date, 2034-06-01. It hadn't happened yet. I ran the spectrogram. It wasn't audio in the traditional sense. It was a layered signal, mathematical, like the ones used in old number stations. Prime sequences nested inside waveform pulses, each pair of tones matching coordinates I'd already seen. But then came something new. The signal ended with a string of frequencies, that corresponded to transmission bands used by early weather satellites, ones no longer in orbit. I cross-referenced them. One match stood out, a French oceanographic satellite from 2008 that had gone off course and was written off as a malfunction, but its final transmission matched the coordinates perfectly. June 7th, same location, same shape. But here's the part that made me go cold. Its onboard data said the landmass was rising, not in imagery but in altitude. The anomaly wasn't just appearing, it was surfacing, slowly, predictably, like something resurfacing from a
schedule, not a current, a controlled emergence.
When I pieced together the timing, the pattern was exact. Every 26 years, 7 days of visibility, each time at a slightly higher elevation, which meant that on its next cycle, 2034, it wouldn't just appear, it might breach. And someone already knew. The absolute non-engagement directive wasn't a guideline, it was a countdown. I live quietly now, under a different name, far from the coast, and even farther from satellites. The truth, or at least what I know of it, exists only in fragments, burned onto unmarked disks, locked in safety deposit boxes I no longer visit. I won't try to share it anymore, not because I'm afraid, not anymore, but because I finally understand that some truths aren't buried to protect secrets. They're buried to protect everything else. The sixth continent was never just about geography or surveillance blind spots. It was a cycle, a system of emergence, too precise to be natural, too patterned to be accidental. And the closer I got to it, the more I saw how many layers were in place to keep people like me from even asking the right questions. Faber had tried to document it. His data was real. His disappearance was final. Whatever organization intercepted his work knew exactly what they were doing. And now I'm certain it wasn't just governments. The suppression was too surgical, the signals too clean. This wasn't an oversight, it was orchestration. The last piece fell into place not from a file or a scan, but from a box of old oceanographic charts I had stashed years ago and forgotten. I found them while sorting through what little I'd kept. On the back of one was a hand-drawn grid overlay, uneven at first glance, but when matched against lunar tide data, it formed a sequence, not dates, not locations, phases, pressure windows, a tidal rhythm timed perfectly with the anomaly's rise. It was nature playing host to something unnatural, or perhaps something older than we are willing to consider. I'm not sure what it is, not anymore. A remnant, a machine, a fragment of a world before ours. But I know it's still out there, waiting. And I know that in less than a decade it will rise again, higher than before. I won't be around to see it. I've accepted that. I've deleted the last of the backups, closed every door behind me, and left no trail. I'm not handing it off to anyone else. This story ends with me, not because it should, but because someone has to stop chasing it. Let the continent rise, let it disappear again, let it remain untouched, as it has always demanded. And if it returns once more, as I believe it will, may it rise to an ocean that no longer recognizes us. 3 days from now, the stars are supposed to disappear, and the proof was painted on a cave wall 10,000 years ago. I was in northern Arizona to photograph ancient petroglyphs for a freelance project. Nothing glamorous, just a low-paying gig for an academic journal no one really reads. I've done enough of these to know what to expect. Faded spirals, animals with too many legs, the occasional sun symbol. But this cave, tucked behind a washed-out ridge near a dried riverbed, was different from the start. It was sealed by a rock slide only partially uncovered by a recent monsoon. The air inside was strangely dry, undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of recent activity. My flashlight picked up the usual symbols along the outer walls until I reached the back corner. There, drawn in red ochre and scorched black pigment, was a sky. A primitive one, yes, but clearly a sky. And it was empty. No stars, no moon, just a black dome above a jagged horizon. Below it, etched with sharp lines that looked newer than the rest, was a date. I thought I was misreading it, but after cross-referencing the notation style and plugging it into my phone's offline converter, the translation was unmistakable. It marked a specific day, 3 days from now. At first, I laughed. Not out loud, just that awkward, automatic disbelief. I took a photo thinking maybe it was a prank, or maybe someone added it recently as a joke. But the pigment flaked like the rest of the painting. It was old, it belonged. That's what unsettled me most. The symbol wasn't part of a larger
narrative or calendar cycle. It stood alone as if to say, this is the day everything changes. I stayed there for hours studying the surface, checking for modern contamination, trying to explain it away.
But every test I ran only confirmed what I didn't want to accept. This wasn't a hoax, and that single, unblinking date kept staring back at me like a deadline. The stars would go out in 3 days. I left the cave before sunset, but I didn't sleep that night. I kept looking out my window, waiting for something in the sky to flicker. Nothing did. Not yet. The next morning, I uploaded the photo of the cave wall to a private drive I use for field backups. I didn't tag it, didn't label it, just a timestamp and a folder named Untitled. I wasn't ready to show anyone, not yet. I kept thinking maybe I'd imagined it, maybe the stress of the heat or the isolation had scrambled my perception. But when I opened the photo on my laptop and zoomed in, the date was still there, as clear as it had been in person. I couldn't explain that part away. I started digging, quietly. I used an encrypted browser and went through archaeological forums, obscure translation databases, even scanned through digitized expedition logs from the 1930s. I wasn't looking for a match, just anything even vaguely similar. After about 5 hours of sifting through dead links and outdated FTP servers, I found something. A post from an anonymous user on a defunct anthropology message board. The thread was titled Chronomarks in Paleo-Southwest Symbolism. It hadn't been updated in over a decade. Most of the comments were garbage, armchair theories, misreadings, but one caught my attention. A user named F. Osiris had uploaded a sketch of a cave etching from a now collapsed site near the Utah border. The symbols weren't identical to what I'd seen, but the structure was the same. An empty sky and a single isolated date. Different numbers, though. That one had been dated to the early 1900s. According to follow-up replies, the stars hadn't vanished then. So I dismissed it at first. But as I rechecked the sketch, I noticed something subtle in the corner. Smaller glyphs.
Almost like footnotes.
One of them matched a minor mark I hadn't paid much attention to in my own photo. A vertical stroke bisected by 2 shorter horizontal lines. I searched that shape next and found references in 3 separate academic journals, each calling it by a different name, but all associating it with one idea: an absence event. Not death, not destruction, just absence. Something gone without trace or violence. The kind of idea that feels harmless until you apply it to the night sky. That night, I stayed up watching the stars again. Nothing looked different. But when I tried uploading a backup of the cave image to a cloud drive I sometimes use, it failed. Twice. Then the drive locked me out entirely, claiming a permissions conflict I'd never seen before. I wasn't even sure who could trigger that. Unless someone had seen what I uploaded and didn't want it leaving my laptop. The next day, I drove into Flagstaff to use a library terminal I knew wasn't networked to anything modern. I couldn't trust my own devices anymore, not after what happened with the cloud lockout. I brought a portable hard drive and started digging through university archives, old field journals, expedition photos, anything with unprocessed or uncatalogued records. From the southwest region, I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I found it. Buried in a digitized field notebook from 1971, an anthropologist named D. Whitaker had made a brief mention of a skyless glyph cluster found in a shallow cave near the Hopi Reservation. He called it unresolved, possibly metaphorical, and moved on. But he included a Polaroid in his notes, grainy and underexposed. I adjusted the contrast and stared at it until my eyes burned. It wasn't identical to mine, but it had the same absence. No celestial markings, just a dome, a horizon, and in the lower left corner, another date. It was crossed out. There was no explanation, just that single annotation in pencil. Didn't happen. I couldn't stop thinking about that. Did Whitaker mean the event didn't happen, or that it was prevented? And why cross it out if it was just symbolic? I checked the date. March 21st in 1973, vernal equinox. That seemed deliberate. A moment of cosmic alignment, like a signal that didn't quite send. And now, 51 years later, here I was looking at the same kind of mark, only this one wasn't crossed out. This one had a deadline. My mind kept circling that phrase. Absence event. Not an explosion, not a disappearance in the usual sense, just gone, quietly, like the lights being shut.
Off in a room you didn't realize had a switch.
I found more references as I kept digging, obscure mentions in comparative mythology, patterns in stories told thousands of miles apart. One from a Mayan codex that described a night where the breath of the sky ceased. Another from a Siberian carving where the stars were shown clustered tightly in a circle with everything outside depicted as black void. I printed what I could, took screenshots of the rest, and returned to my car feeling like I was standing ankle deep in an ocean
I hadn't realized was there.
I wasn't chasing a symbol anymore. This was a pattern, a message repeating across cultures and centuries. They'd all seen it, not often, not recently, but enough to leave a mark. And now, for some reason, it had chosen this moment to return. 2 days left. I kept telling myself it couldn't be real, that I was spiraling, that sleep deprivation was making everything seem bigger than it was, but I couldn't stop. I needed something physical, something I could see and touch that might confirm or disprove what was happening. So I went back to the cave. Not the original one, I knew that would be watched by now, but the archive photo from Whitaker's notes had a coordinate reference partially visible at the top of the page, a handwritten margin code I recognized as a USGS grid marker. I triangulated it and found a rough location about 30 miles north of where I'd been, deep inside a dry wash off a Forest Service road nobody uses. I parked a mile out and hiked the rest. No trails, no signage. The air felt still in that
unnatural way, like the environment itself was waiting. It took me 3 hours to find the entrance, half buried behind a dead juniper and a spill of eroded rock. It didn't look like much, just a crack in the cliffside. But when I slipped,
through flashlight in hand, I knew I was in the right place. The air changed, cooler, hollow, and the walls bore faint pigment traces, not as vivid as the first cave, but unmistakably human. I moved deeper until I reached the back wall. There it was again, the dark arc of a sky, the flat suggestion of land beneath it. No stars, no moon, just space. But this one had something else carved below it, not a date, a map, crude, overlapping lines that I eventually recognized as constellations. Not current ones, star positions from the past marked in stages. They moved in reverse, each iteration pushing the stars further outward until they vanished altogether.
I photographed everything. I traced the grooves with my fingertips. The final segment wasn't just empty, it was scorched.
Burned into the wall as if someone had branded the stone with fire. No pigments, no chisel. Just carbon. I stayed in that cave for what felt like hours, watching the light from my flashlight dim. When I stepped back outside, the sun was already low. I looked up out of habit. Everything still looked normal. But it didn't feel normal. I had the sense I was no longer discovering something. I was catching up to it. And whatever it was, it had been waiting a long time for someone to notice.
I didn't go home.
I drove past the turn-off to my place without thinking, kept going until I found a cheap roadside motel with a vacancy sign that buzzed like it hadn't been turned off in years. I paid cash, signed a fake name, and covered the room's single window with a bath towel. My laptop stayed off. My phone was powered down and battery removed, wrapped in foil and stuffed under the mattress. I wasn't being dramatic. Someone had flagged the photo upload days ago, maybe the moment I'd taken it. And now, with 2 days left, the idea of trusting any network, even public ones, felt reckless. I laid everything out on the bed. Printouts from the archives, the photo of the cave etching, sketches from the second site, and a small notebook I'd started filling with patterns, cross-references, names of researchers who had mentioned similar anomalies but never connected them. They were all missing the one thing I now had, a deadline. I kept running one question over and over in my head. What happens when the stars go out? Not in the poetic sense, literally, no stars, just black sky. Is that even physically possible? And if it is, what would cause it? Atmospheric interference? Artificial obfuscation? Something cosmic? I found myself spiraling into message boards, dark web threads, anything that might hint at celestial anomalies, classified space projects, high-altitude emissions, anything that could blot out starlight on a planetary scale. One theory, buried in a dead forum from 2009, talked about a rumoured satellite array positioned in high Earth orbit. Not weaponized, not for surveillance, something else. It was described as a veil system, a network designed to emit a synthetic sky in case of global optical panic. The post was ridiculed at the time. But the phrasing caught me. Not in case of attack, in case of panic. As if it wasn't the event itself they feared, but what people might see when it happened. I copied the post, traced its metadata, and found that it originated from a university lab in New Mexico. The author was listed only as K. Walker. That's where I made the mistake. I searched his name on a secure academic database using the motel's Wi-Fi. Not 10 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot and didn't leave. The engine idled, lights off. I stayed still, heart hammering, and watched from between the blinds. No one knocked, no one came to the door. But I knew then that whatever I'd uncovered wasn't just ancient, it was current, protected, active, and someone else knew I'd seen it. I left the motel just after midnight, walking a mile down the highway before calling a rideshare from a prepaid burner I'd kept for years and never used. I gave the driver coordinates to an abandoned radio observatory in the high desert, a place shuttered in the late 90s after funding dried up, or so the public story goes. The access road was still drivable if you knew where to turn. I'd visited once before during a college internship, back when the equipment inside was already gathering dust and the offices smelled like mildew and solder. I wasn't going there for nostalgia. I was going because I needed line of sight. No trees, no buildings, no light pollution. If the stars were going to vanish, I wanted to see it happen. I arrived just before 3. The observatory's dish loomed in the dark like a fossil from a forgotten future. I climbed to the control room, powered what systems I could using a field battery, and connected a modified DSLR to the old telescope mount. I pointed it at the Orion constellation, took a baseline reading, and waited. Every few minutes I snapped another exposure, logging coordinates, brightness, variance. At 3:41 a.m. the camera stopped registering light from the eastern quadrant of the sky. Not dimming, disappearance. The raw file was blank in that section, no stars, no background noise, nothing. I checked manually. The stars were still there, to my naked eye but weaker, flickering like they were behind something. Then they blinked out, one by one, not a sweep, not a fade, a sequence, timed, patterned. I froze. My breathing went shallow. A second later, my phone buzzed. I hadn't turned it on. The screen lit up with a notification I didn't recognize, an app I never installed, showing a countdown, 32 hours remaining. Then the phone powered off by itself. I stared at the dark glass, trying to understand how it had activated, how it had displayed a message without signal or power. And I realized something then, something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud. This wasn't a warning, it was a schedule. And I hadn't discovered the date in the cave by accident. I'd been led to it. From the forum threads to the blocked uploads from the cave map to the SUV outside my room, none of this had been a chase. It was an introduction. I looked up again. The sky above me for the first time in my life felt like it was closing. I didn't try to stop it. That thought used to bother me, but not anymore. There was no lever to pull, no switch to throw, no person to expose. I wasn't standing at the edge of a mystery. I was inside something already unfolding, something old and patient and precise. When the sky finally went dark, it wasn't dramatic. No rumble, no flash, just absence. like someone had flipped off a background track you didn't know had been playing your whole life. I was still at the observatory when it happened. It was 2:13 a.m. The last stars winked out together, not in silence exactly, but in a hush I could feel behind my eyes. The darkness wasn't pitch black. It was deeper than that. Heavy. A kind of presence in reverse. I stayed for hours, unsure if I was supposed to do something, call someone, mark the moment. But nothing came. No announcement, no alert. Just the hum of old equipment and the steady beat of my own pulse in the quiet. Eventually I packed what I could and started driving east, avoiding major roads, keeping to back routes. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't go home. Not because someone was after me, but because the idea of home had stopped meaning anything. Everyone else I met along the way seemed normal, too normal. People still went to work, bought groceries and looked at their phones. It took me a while to understand why. It wasn't happening everywhere. It was only above certain latitudes, specific zones, targeted. I watched the coverage come in slowly, fragmented and vague. Atmospheric distortion, solar inversion, thermal anomalies. Scientists trotted out terms that didn't explain anything. No one said the stars are gone. That phrase didn't make it into the headlines. And still, every night, more sky disappeared, a creeping edge across the globe, rolling outward from the caves, from the map, from that first date. Some places held out longer, some never saw it at all. But I did. I was there when it began. I think that matters. I don't talk about it anymore, not directly. The people who needed to know, whatever they were, already got what they wanted. I wasn't the only one they led to the truth, just the one who saw it clearly enough to stop asking questions. Now I sleep during the day and drive at night, always toward whatever darkness hasn't arrived yet. The stars are gone, yes, but something else has replaced them. Not light, not even a shadow, just a feeling, like the sky is listening now, and whatever it's listening for, it's getting closer. No one in my family had set foot in Lonsdale since 1883, yet last winter I inherited a key engraved with my surname and coordinates to a town that doesn't exist on any current map. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, just my name, Avery Holm, in a style of cursive no one uses anymore. Inside was a brass key, worn but heavy, engraved with 4 digits and my last name. The back held something stranger, etched coordinates leading to somewhere in upstate New York, a dense patch of forest I'd driven past dozens of times without knowing it was ever occupied. I ignored it at first. Keys show up all the time, old trunks, forgotten lockers, abandoned sheds. But something about the way this one felt in my hand unsettled me, like it had waited. I showed it to my mother and she turned pale, said nothing, and left the room. When I pressed her, she only said one thing: burn it. Naturally, I didn't. I traced the coordinates to a place that didn't exist on current maps. No town, no records, no road signs. But on a faded 1879 surveyor's chart, it was there, Lonsdale. A name I'd never heard, marked with a small, engraved key symbol. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started dreaming of locked doors in stone corridors, of rooms filled with dust and silence. Each time I woke, there was a metallic taste in my mouth and a strange sense of being watched. When I finally drove out there, my phone lost signal a mile before the forest thickened. I walked the rest. And when I found the half-buried stone path beneath pine needles, I didn't feel fear. I felt recognized. The key in my pocket had grown warm. I followed the trail until I saw the first door. Solid granite, sealed with a rusted lock shaped like an eye. I stood for a long time, breathing in wet earth and cold air. Then I reached into my coat and took out the key. It slid
into the lock without resistance.
The door opened with a sound like lungs taking breath, and just like that I stepped into the city of 1,000 keys. Inside, the air was dry and colder than it should have been. Dust floated in slow spirals through the faint light that leaked from narrow vents cut high into the stone. The space beyond the door wasn't a room. It felt like the start of something buried. A corridor stretched forward, sloping downward, lined with doors on both sides. Everyone had a brass plate and a lock, each with a different design. None were open. I moved quietly, the sound of my boots muffled by centuries of silence. There were no insects, no mold, no smell of decay, just the stillness of something preserved. I should have turned back, but instead I pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, there was no service, but to document. The photos came out warped, colors bleeding, details blurred. When I tried uploading them later, every file was corrupted, but one frame, buried deep in cache data, showed something I hadn't seen in real time, a chalk symbol above one of the doors. I enhanced it. It matched a sketch I'd seen once in my grandfather's attic, scrawled in the corner of a notebook he never let anyone read. I remembered asking about it as a kid. He'd closed the book and told me never to bring it up again. I found that same notebook buried in a trunk in the basement. On the last page was a list of names, most crossed out. 7 remained. One of them was mine. Each name had a number beside it, and what looked like a date, but none were logical. Some were centuries old, others were marked only with symbols. I searched public records, family registries, newspaper archives. Nothing. The names didn't appear anywhere. It was like they'd never existed. I posted the chalk symbol on an obscure cryptology forum. Within minutes, someone messaged me directly. No name, no profile, just one sentence. If you're seeing this, you've already unlocked more than you should. You need to stop. But instead of fear, I felt a strange recognition, and I knew then the city wasn't just waiting, it was searching. I didn't go back to Lonsdale for 4 days. I told myself I needed more time to prepare, to research, but the truth was simpler. I was scared. Not of what I'd seen, but of what I now couldn't unsee. During those 4 days, I buried myself in message boards and obscure family history sites. I kept rereading that list from the notebook, the remaining names, the ones not yet crossed out. Mine was 5th from the way at bottom. The phrase at the top, Ultum ex sanguine, kept circling in my mind. I sent it to a friend who translated Old Latin. She wrote back the next morning. Roughly, it means sealed by blood. That's when I decided to speak to my mother again. She didn't deny anything. She only asked one question. You opened the door, didn't you? I told her yes. She looked away for a long time, then told me a story she said she was never supposed to repeat. When she was 10, her father took her there, just once, and made her promise never to return. She said the doors were matched to names, and names were matched to times. It was a ritual, not superstition, a design. Each door belonged to a bloodline. Opening it at the wrong time caused something to shift in the system, something no one wanted to explain. The city had once been managed, quietly, deliberately, by families like ours. But the management failed. Some stopped returning. Some vanished. No one spoke of it publicly, but within those circles it was understood. When only a few names remained, the locks began to behave differently. They didn't resist. They called. I asked how many were left. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, 7. The number from the notebook, from the message, from the corridor. I had thought I'd discovered something hidden, but I hadn't uncovered a secret. I had stepped into a countdown already in motion. I returned to Lonsdale just after dawn, with fog clinging low across the forest floor, like something trying to hold me back. I brought the journal, both keys, and a flashlight. The path to the granite door was unchanged, still partially hidden by fallen pine. It stood open, the way I'd left it. This time, I didn't hesitate. I retraced my steps to the door marked by chalk. I tried the second key, the one with the flame symbol. It turned smoothly, and the door opened into a circular chamber with no furnishings, just a low iron pedestal at its center and deep grooves in the surrounding walls. The floor was layered with a fine dust, undisturbed except for faint boot prints, decades old, maybe older. The pedestal held a sealed box with no hinges, no seams, just solid black metal and a faint, pulsing hum. When I placed my hand on it, the box warmed beneath my skin. A thin crack appeared, then opened without sound. Inside were papers tied with string and a photograph. The image was old, sepia-toned, 7 people standing outside a stone corridor. One was my grandfather. Another looked like a younger version of my mother. The others I didn't recognize. I unfolded the pages. They weren't letters, they were transcripts, interviews, records, meeting notes, mentions of a reckoning, of doors tied to a calendar no one seemed to control anymore, and something called the Chamber Without Return. The final page, dated 1972, ended with a sentence in red ink. When only 7 remain, the gate will search for them. I didn't understand what gate it meant or why it searched, but I understood this. The city wasn't forgotten, it was waiting, and someone, maybe everyone, had underestimated its patience. I didn't tell anyone what I found. I left the city and drove to a motel an hour north, uploaded scans of the transcript to an encrypted cloud folder, and wrapped the originals in plastic, hiding them inside the ice machine. That night, the power went out for exactly 6 minutes. When it came back, my laptop was on, the cursor hovering over the cloud sync icon. Nothing was deleted, but someone had been inside. The next morning, a black SUV with no plates sat parked across the street. No movement, no driver visible. I left fast. I drove to a cabin owned by a co-worker, one I'd used before. No one knew I was there. I printed a map of the city and started, plotting the corridors. 7 spokes, 13 doors each, 91 in total. The transcripts had mentioned that exact number, 91 sanctums, only 7 remain. The phrase felt heavier now. I searched the names in public records again. Most had vanished without explanation. I posted fragments anonymously online. My thread was deleted within an hour. My account was locked. The next day, a courier arrived, with no listed delivery. He left a box. Inside was a broken padlock and a note with 4 words. Do not open it. The padlock bore the same 13-tooth arch symbol. On the back, scratched faintly, a date. Tomorrow's date. When I held it, something shifted, not around me, but in me, like a door I hadn't known was there had cracked open, and I was being asked to follow. I arrived at the corridor marked Spoke 5 just after noon, fog still thick between the trees. The air had weight, like standing too close to a storm. The 7th door in the corridor bore the same symbol etched into the padlock, the arch, sharp and deep. I held the broken lock to it. No click. No release. But the door opened. Inside was a narrow stairwell cut deep into the earth, rougher than the rest of the city, older. I followed it down. At the bottom was a vault-like chamber, circular, walls covered in geometric carvings that matched the echoing symbols from the journal. At its center stood a woman, alive, not aged, not frozen, just waiting. Pale skin, eyes closed, dressed in early 1900s formal clothing. I recognized her from one of the missing family records, Marla Keene. I spoke her name. She opened her eyes and spoke in a language I couldn't fully place. Latin? Hebrew? Something else? The walls reacted, lines lit up. A hum started low and steady. She explained, not as a warning, but as a conclusion. The city was a convergence point, not a tomb, not a machine, but a system. The families were nodes, the doors, stabilizers, the bloodlines, locks. Each generation was tied to a door. As names were lost, the system failed, and now only I remained. I had triggered the circuit's close. The mechanism was responding, and I couldn't stop it. When I turned to leave, the stairwell was gone. In its place, a blank wall. Marla stepped back, eyes still open. I sank to the floor, realizing I hadn't found a secret. I had reactivated it. I don't know how long I was in that chamber. Days, maybe more. Time twisted in ways that didn't make sense. I began to dream while awake. My memories looped, reorganized. The walls whispered in patterns, not words. Eventually, the wall behind me opened, revealing a long, clean passageway. I walked until I reached the corridor again, climbed to the surface, and stepped back into the forest. My car was still there, untouched. But something had changed. I felt it in the air, in the quiet. I drove home, tried to tell someone, tried 3 times. The files deleted themselves. Emails bounced. My name vanished from public records. My bank account froze. I no longer existed in the systems that mattered. One night I received a message on a dead laptop, screen black but the words glowing faintly. It's awake. I still have the keys. Both of them. They're heavier now. I keep them in a locked drawer. I check every morning, but I already know they won't be there forever. Some nights I dream of new doors. ones I've never seen. And always, always, I hear the same phrase in a voice that sounds like mine, but isn't. The city is full, but the locks are listening. My grandfather used to say the ancient Egyptians didn't just look at the stars, they looked through them. I never took that seriously until I found the sketches in his attic. He'd been a professor of Near Eastern archaeology, the type who never really retired. His house was packed with journals, maps, and relics from decades of fieldwork across North Africa. After his funeral, the family asked me to help organize the estate. That's how I ended up in the attic, brushing dust off crates labeled in pencil. One box was marked Saqqara Anomaly 1973. Inside were 3 notebooks, a few yellowed photographs, and a single brass disc wrapped in cloth. The first photo showed a stone chamber with a circular groove in the floor. The second zoomed in on a brass gear embedded in limestone, surrounded by soot. His notes were meticulous, field measurements, mineral analyses, but the language was oddly cautious. He called the object optical and calculated, but never explained what it did. The phrase that stuck with me: structure predates the dynastic wall by 700 plus years. Purpose unknown, possibly not Egyptian. I scanned the notes and uploaded them to my laptop. There were references to locations that didn't exist on any map, and a list of global coordinates labeled confirmed projection nodes. Out of curiosity, I checked a few of them. Every single point landed on a coastline, not just in Egypt, but Brazil, Australia, even the Canadian Arctic. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was a comparative study, something about ancient seafaring theories, but one note, hastily scribbled in the margin, unsettled me. You don't need ships if you can see beyond the sea. I hadn't planned on digging further, but once I uploaded the scanned pages, the inconsistencies became harder to ignore. My grandfather's handwriting had always been clean, measured, but his later notes were rushed, diagrams more urgent, terms less academic. Tucked inside a notebook was a printout of an email chain from 2002 between him and someone named Dr. Elroy Sivas at the University of Turin. They discussed ancient lenses and primitive optics, but Sivas's final question caught me. Have you verified the parallax against known transmarine landmarks? That led me back to my grandfather's diagrams. Field of view charts, traced lines converging on ocean horizons, each annotated with angles and unfamiliar symbols. I dropped the coordinates into Google Earth again. The lines formed arcs, each terminating precisely on coastal features, always at sea level, always unobstructed. That shouldn't be possible. I found an old archaeology forum with a thread from 2004 describing a collimated viewing shaft under a ruined granary near Dakhla Oasis. The photos were gone. The user hadn't posted in years. One reply said, "They shut us down when we found the mirrored slab, said it wasn't glass, said it shouldn't exist." I couldn't sleep that night. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. These weren't random artifacts or misunderstood designs. This was a system, deliberate, ancient, and built to observe far more than the sky. I spent the next several days researching ancient optical devices, not the usual sundials or polished copper mirrors, but something closer to engineered vision. Most records focused on stargazing or ritual astronomy, but a few obscure sources hinted at something more complex. A retracted 1971 journal article described quartz lenses near Aswan arranged to mimic the zodiac. The paper had been erased from most archives, but I found a PDF in a private European repository. It mentioned anomalous magnification across an angular matrix with no known explanation. My grandfather had highlighted a paragraph and scrawled, "Same arrangement, Saqqara." I reviewed the floor plan again. Sure enough, etched faintly into the groove was a hexagonal pattern, almost imperceptible. It matched the Aswan lens geometry. I examined the brass disc again. Under magnification, it showed a faint grid of alignment markers, north-south, elevation, and one curious offset of 3 degrees. I used a ray tracing tool designed for telescope simulations. If this chamber housed a lens of the right curvature, aimed precisely at the horizon and adjusted for Earth's rotation, the beam intersected a point just offshore from Brazil. It didn't prove anything, not yet. But the more I studied the system, the more convinced I became that it wasn't about light. It was about location. The horizon machine, if that's what this was, wasn't a map or a calendar. It was a viewer, calibrated not for time, but for place. I had to see it myself. The coordinates pointed to a long-forgotten structure on the outskirts of Saqqara, outside any active dig site. I found it hidden behind a crumbling fence near a half-collapsed storage building. No signs, no guards, just a concrete slab half buried in sand. I pried it open to reveal a shaft descending steeply into darkness. The steps were carved into stone, shallow, old, but stable. At the bottom was a chamber no larger than a classroom. Smooth walls, no writing, only intersecting angles carved with mathematical precision. At the center stood a low stone pedestal with a concave surface. I placed the brass disc into the depression. It clicked into place. For a moment, nothing
happened. Then a line of light appeared on the far wall, perfectly horizontal, razor-thin.
It wasn't reflected light. It was projected. The line pulsed and shifted, slowly outlining a ghost-like contour. I recognized it immediately, the eastern coastline of South America. It was precise, impossible, and completely out of place. The projection disappeared within seconds, but the implications didn't. I now understood why my grandfather kept this secret. It wasn't that no one would believe him. It was that someone already had, and they didn't want it rediscovered. I told myself I'd walk away, but that projection kept playing in my mind. When I tried to upload the footage to a private server, it vanished. No backups, no file history. The folder itself was gone. My phone gallery wiped too. Then came the stranger in the hotel lobby, newspaper held upside down, eyes locked on mine. He stood and left without a word. The next morning, the front desk said I had checked out already. My key card was deactivated. My reservation was erased. I drove west to meet one of my grandfather's retired colleagues, Dr. Farouk al-Nasir. Half-blind, barely mobile, but when I showed him a sketch of the chamber, he whispered. He found the horizon machine. I asked what it meant. He said, "It doesn't show what's there, it shows where to look." That night, I ditched my phone, changed hotels, and paid cash. I was being watched. No threats, no knocks on the door, just quiet erasure. The kind you don't notice until it's done. It wasn't about what I'd seen. It was about what I might say. And now I understood what my grandfather must have realized too late. Some discoveries aren't buried by time. They're buried on purpose. I returned to the chamber before dawn. The slab was undisturbed, but inside the projection had reactivated. This time the line wasn't flat. It arced, rising slowly until it terminated in a single hovering point of light. Not static, moving, layering shapes that didn't match any Earth map I'd ever seen. Coastlines curved the wrong way. Mountains where none existed. A different Earth, or a different memory of it. The light vanished suddenly. I stumbled out, dazed. My phone was dead. My watch had reset. Back in Cairo, an email appeared. No sender, no subject. One sentence. You are not alone down there. It deleted itself before I could react. Then came the photo, the chamber taken from an angle I'd never used. On the back, we preserve what they chose to hide. I didn't know who sent it, but the message was clear. The Horizon machine wasn't abandoned, it was monitored. And I had triggered something that didn't want to be activated again. I didn't return. I didn't need to. The Horizon machine had done its work. I withdrew from everything, shut down my social accounts, disconnected from the research circles. I buried the disk in a place no one would find, not even me. But it doesn't matter, I still see that line of light sometimes, not in the sky, but behind my eyes. A perfect thread, tracing coastlines we were never meant to know about. My grandfather had once written, "Discovery ends belief. That's why they keep it hidden." I understand now, the chamber wasn't a tool of exploration, it was a mirror of memory, a machine for recalling what had been forgotten or erased.
I live simply now, but I'm not the same. Once you've seen the world through a different lens, the old view never quite returns. Somewhere beneath the sand, the light still pulses, waiting for someone else to look and remember.
I used to think coral reefs just grew randomly until I overlaid one with an old blueprint and realized someone had followed it like instructions. I work for the Institute of Marine Cartography, which sounds more impressive than it is. Most days I catalogue reef formations using satellite data and cross-reference them against tide patterns. It's solitary, repetitive work, perfect for someone like me, quiet, methodical, uninterested in office chatter. I was running a standard, scan near the Seychelles, reviewing coral growth patterns for a conservation project, when something caught my attention. The reef wasn't just thriving, it was symmetrical, too symmetrical. Coral doesn't grow in perfect alignment, yet this formation mirrored a geometric structure with clear lines and evenly spaced tiers. Curious, I overlaid it with one of the old architectural blueprints from my personal archive, a 1950s design for a pyramid-shaped marine research station that had never been built. It wasn't a vague match, it was exact, layer for layer, angle for angle. I double-checked the bathymetric data. The reef was growing on flat seabed, no rock formations or underwater ridges to guide it into that shape. I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, but it lingered. I'd spent over a decade staring at ocean floor data, and this didn't look natural. It looked intentional. That night, I encrypted the coordinates, backed up the file offline, and shut everything
down. I didn't tell anyone, but I couldn't let it go.
Because if coral had followed that blueprint, the only question that mattered was who had given it something to follow. The next morning, I reopened the file with the kind of nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. I told myself I was checking for a software glitch or calibration error, something to explain the perfect alignment, but what I found pushed the explanation even further from coincidence. The sonar imaging had tracked the reef's shape over time, and the changes weren't gradual, they were incremental, as if new layers had been added in measured steps. I marked each growth phase. They occurred roughly every 4 years, almost, to the day. That's not how coral behaves. Coral doesn't follow timetables. I expanded the search, looking through survey data from other organizations. A few drones had passed through the area. One lost contact entirely, another returned, with corrupted files. A pattern started to form. Equipment malfunction, navigation errors, incomplete footage. I ran spectral analysis on the sonar data and discovered a low-frequency signal embedded in the background, repeating steadily. It wasn't marine life. It wasn't mechanical interference. I split the waveform and aligned it against the blueprint grid. The pulses matched the pyramid's base layout perfectly. It was like an acoustic fingerprint stamped into the seafloor. Then, for the first time, the lights in my office flickered, just once. The signal was cut out. When I ran the file again, the anomaly was gone. I took a few days off work, said I had a migraine, which wasn't far from the truth. At home, I pulled out old storage drives, archives from grad school, independent maritime research forums, declassified scans. I dug into anything that might validate what I'd found. That's when I came across an old French naval survey from 1982. It labelled the reef site as Anomalie Topographique 16B, a subsurface interference zone. Their submersible had lost comms during a cable-laying operation. The mission was aborted. The footage was corrupted. Nothing was ever published. Funding records pointed to a now-defunct company called Irenos Maritime Holdings. I traced it further and found it had quietly financed several undersea engineering studies in the 1950s, the same decade the pyramid blueprint had surfaced. A name kept appearing across documents, Dr. Anton Kavacek, a marine geologist with one peer-reviewed paper on subglacial architectural formations and no further academic record. I found the paper. The diagrams looked familiar, tiered steps, angular growth patterns, and one note scribbled in the margin. Matches no known civilization, possibly non-anthropogenic. Structure exhibits replication behavior. I stared at those words for a long time. Replication behavior. The reef wasn't mimicking something built, it was rebuilding something placed. I flew to Mahé under the guise of attending a conservation symposium. I brought everything with me, data, footage, backup drives, but kept the real purpose to myself. The reef sat inside a protected marine zone established in the late 90s, labelled a coral rehabilitation site, but no recent research had been conducted there. I found a local diver named Thomas, paid him in cash, and asked for a drop-off near the coordinates. He didn't ask questions. From the surface, the reef looked normal, vibrant even, but the moment I descended, I felt it. The temperature dropped, the visibility tightened, and the silence deepened. I found the formation easily. 5 distinct terraces, a central rise, and at the base, an object embedded in coral. Rectangular, unnatural, covered in etched lines arranged in grids. It wasn't eroded, it was clean, exposed, fused to the reef like they'd grown together. I filmed it, circled once, then returned.
On shore, I looked into the site's history.
Before its protection status, the area was earmarked for undersea drilling until the project was cancelled after unexplained magnetometer interference disabled their rig. One forum thread, long since deleted, described a drill striking metal that rang hollow. I played my dive footage back that night, frame by frame. In one shot, the panel shimmered, not from light, but from motion, a subtle, one-time shift. And in the audio, layered under my breathing, a familiar pulse, 41 Hz, perfectly timed, no noise, not echo, a signal I hadn't intended to involve anyone else, but silence was beginning to feel like a choice I didn't want to keep making. I sent a fragment of the signal to an old colleague, a marine systems analyst. I didn't explain much, just asked if he'd seen anything like it. He didn't reply. That afternoon, my phone rang once, then disconnected. When I tried calling back, the number was invalid. That night, my hotel Wi-Fi was cut out. The staff blamed a local outage, but none of the surrounding properties reported issues. I switched hotels, went offline, checked everything. When I returned to my room later, nothing appeared disturbed, but one page from my notebook was gone, the sketch of the panel, the only page describing its placement. I confronted the desk manager. He offered to call the police, but I declined. I already knew they wouldn't find anything. The next day I went to find Thomas. He was gone. His boat, gear, even his name on the marina log, scratched out. Not deleted, removed with intention. I reached out to a research lab in Réunion that had logged deep-sea anomalies in the region. Their website was active, but their contact information was wiped. Every page led nowhere. That night I started making copies, hard drives, printouts, encrypted packages. I mailed them to 3 locations under borrowed names. I wasn't scared, not exactly. But I had the sense that I was no longer just studying something hidden. I was standing in the way of something meant to stay that way. I returned to the reef one final time. I chartered a boat anonymously, paid in cash, and dove alone. I didn't bring sonar, just cameras, lights, and a pressure monitor. The reef was, as I remembered, but the panel had changed. The grooves were deeper, the coral around it darker. A split had formed beneath it, revealing a tunnel, angled sharply downward, wide enough for one person. I entered. The walls were unnaturally smooth, not eroded, not carved. At 30 meters in, it opened into a chamber. The air, or whatever passed for it, was thick. The walls weren't stone. They flexed subtly, as if breathing. At the center stood a column, semi-transparent, filled with fluid. Inside, something moved, not swimming, not alive in any traditional sense. It shifted form, pulsed faintly, as if reacting to me. The 41 Hz signal surged in my headset so loud I dropped my recorder. For a moment my thoughts blurred. I saw things I couldn't understand. Images, not memories, instructions, the pyramid blueprint, coral binding to metal, something being built, not from above but below. I surfaced hours later, alone. The boat was gone, my camera was cracked, the backup drive was unreadable. I crawled ashore and didn't speak for a day. Whatever was under the reef wasn't a relic. It wasn't waiting for us to find it. It was waking up. I no longer try to explain it. I've seen what happens when you talk too much. The reef is still there. The signal still pulses. Every night, same rhythm, same frequency. But now the pattern is evolving. The intervals have changed slightly. Smaller shifts, more consistent. It's as if something is practicing, communicating, learning. I've built a crude monitoring rig in a storage unit halfway across the world. The equipment's simple, but it's enough to record the signal. I've shared fragments under false. Names buried the data in public repositories no one checks. Someone replied. A small lab in Finland sent me what they called a resonant inversion, a mirrored version of the pulse. When I played it back, it matched perfectly. Not a repeat.
A response. I haven't gone back to the reef, and I won't. Whatever's down there isn't ancient.
It's current. Not forgotten, not broken, designed. The pyramid wasn't a monument, it was a trigger. And the coral wasn't covering it. It was completed. Sometimes I dream about the chamber, the membrane walls, the column, the shape inside, and when I wake up, I can still hear the signal. Not loud, not urgent, just waiting, like it knows I heard it. And it's waiting for me to reply. The constellation didn't just vanish, it was erased. And someone, centuries ago, made sure we'd never know why. Most nights I scanned the stars for noise, cosmic microwave background fluctuations, subtle shifts in spectral lines, the invisible murmurs of the universe talking to itself. I never expected anything to talk back. My name's Dr. Ezra Lin, astrophysicist, grant chaser, habitual overthinker. I work with reconstructed sky maps, digital overlays of ancient star charts aligned with current satellite data. It's tedious work, mostly. Translating hand-drawn medieval sky maps into coordinate data, filtering distortions, correcting for axial precession. Then one evening, buried in a 15th century Persian agricultural calendar, I noticed something wrong. The star cluster labelled Serpentarius didn't align with anything in modern catalogues. Not a simple labelling error, those are common, but a full region of the sky that didn't behave. The math said it should have been there, visible, to the naked eye for over 300 years. Yet by the 1700s, any mention of it abruptly vanished from all surviving charts, as if the cluster had been deliberately wiped from the record. I flagged the anomaly, made notes, filed a report no one would read, but the itch lingered. A historian friend once told me, erased things always leave fingerprints. You just need to know where to dust. So I did. I started cross-referencing ancient texts, Greek, Babylonian, Vedic, and found faint echoes of a 13th zodiac. Not in the stories themselves, but in the gaps. The strange festivals with no known origin, the abandoned notations in almanacs, the missing alignment in harvest cycles that made no agricultural sense, unless there was once a different star guiding them. Still, I would have dismissed it as arcane nonsense if it hadn't been for the satellite report. A low-priority observation, log from an orbital lensing array noted unusual gravitational warping, subtle, persistent, and oddly symmetrical. right where Serpentarius had once been mapped. It wasn't much, just enough to nudge photons off course, but in the silence of space, even whispers echo. Something was still there, something bending light, but not reflecting it. I saved the coordinates to a private drive. Not paranoia, just habit. Then I shut my laptop and stared at the ceiling for a long time. My rational mind told me it was a coincidence. My gut told me otherwise. I didn't set out to chase ghosts in the sky, but sometimes a pattern doesn't give you a choice. Over the next week I isolated the Serpentarius coordinates and fed them into every piece of software at my disposal. Star chart overlays, archival scanners, and gravitational anomaly logs dating back to the early Cold War. Most results came back clean, too clean, like someone had already been there tidying up. Only a few datasets escaped notice, ones housed on forgotten university servers and legacy satellite archives never fully integrated into modern systems. In one of them, a decommissioned observatory's 1981 infrared scan, I found it, a faint blotch of distortion consistent with gravitational lensing just outside the ecliptic, showing no stellar body, no heat signature, no movement. The algorithm labeled it a ghost object. But gravitational lensing doesn't occur without mass. Something had to be there, just not in a form we recognized. I tried triangulating it with newer lensing reports. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Every 33 years something shifted. The anomaly would move slightly westward in arcseconds, then stop. That matched the interval of a known ancient agricultural cycle used by early Mesopotamian cultures, one long dismissed as symbolic. But symbols don't bend light. I dug deeper into anthropology forums, private astronomy listservs, anywhere the algorithm might not have filtered out the fringe. Most of it was noise, but one thread caught my eye, a now deleted conversation from a closed group of amateur skywatchers discussing an invisible companion object near the Serpens constellation. One of them had mapped the anomaly's apparent motion over time. They'd called it the 13th Gate. Their observations were crude, mostly backyard scopes and photographic plates, but the curve matched mine. The final post in the thread read simply, "It's real, and it's not alone." That account went dark 3 days later. No further posts, no trace. It could have been a coincidence. A board poster with a dramatic sign-off, but I copied the thread, archived the user data, and flagged the account's email, then searched for it in breach dumps and metadata crawlers. That's when things got strange. The email had last been active on a research subnet used by a defense contractor affiliated with geospatial surveillance. A dead amateur astronomer wasn't supposed to have access to anything like that. I sat back, staring at the coordinates now pulsing faintly on my screen. If the 13th zodiac was more than myth, someone else had already been watching. And they'd buried it deep. I kept expecting someone to knock on my door. Not out of paranoia, at least not at first, but because every lead I pulled seemed tethered to a thread someone else had already tried to cut. I started cross-referencing historical weather records with the 33-year cycle I'd uncovered, trying to see if that gravitational anomaly ever coincided with physical changes here on
Earth. It did. Every time the anomaly realigned with the solar plane, something happened.
Not just random weather shifts, there were spikes in atmospheric ionization, unusual animal migrations, and clusters of recorded mass movement in human populations that official histories explained away as famine or tribal conflict. But in satellite era data, there was something more specific. A measurable uptick in upper atmospheric auroral distortion, the kind caused not by solar flares, but by intense, localized magnetic anomalies. I compiled reports going back to the late 19th century, ship logs, early meteorological journals, crop failure records, all of which pointed to a repeating disruption every few decades centered around the same celestial coordinates. That would have been compelling enough on its own, but then I stumbled across an internal memo from a 1974 NATO symposium on satellite calibration anomalies. It wasn't declassified, but a redacted version had been mirrored on a forgotten FTP archive. One line had survived the blackout: unexplained gravitational interference observed near Serpens Corda region. Recommendation: defer analysis to Astrolabe Group. I'd never heard of the Astrolabe Group. I checked defense contractor indexes, academic consortiums, even disbanded Cold War research cells. Nothing. But the name sounded intentional, like a remnant of an older world, the kind that hid secrets behind science and called it protection. I tried backtracking the group through paper trails, research citations, funding records, anything. But the only hit I got was in the acknowledgement section of an obscure 1962 astronomy monograph. To the Astrolabe Fellows, whose guidance helped illuminate forgotten skyways. That paper, oddly enough, wasn't about stars. It was about timekeeping. The author proposed a theory I'd never seen published elsewhere, that ancient timekeeping systems weren't based on constellations as we know them, but on gravitational reference points, fixed distortions in space-time that early observers sensed, if not understood. In short, they weren't watching the stars. They were watching the space between them. That's when I stopped thinking of Serpentarius as a missing constellation. It hadn't just been removed from charts, it had been reclassified, turned into something hidden in plain sight. And whoever had done it understood that calendars shape civilizations. Because if you can control when people plant, harvest, migrate, you don't just influence history, you become it. The trail led me to a place I hadn't thought about in years. An observatory shuttered in the early 90s after its funding was pulled without explanation. It sat in the hills above Chaco County, overgrown and half buried in snowmelt. Its last recorded maintenance check dated 1994, but according to the metadata in that NATO memo, this site had once uploaded raw lensing data for something called Operation Meridian Intercept, a term I couldn't find referenced anywhere else. No digital traces, no open military records, nothing. That kind of silence isn't an absence, it's a wall someone built on purpose. I drove out under the pretense of survey work and used an expired academic ID to justify my presence if anyone asked. No one did. The road up was half erased by frost and runoff, and the surrounding air had that strange kind of stillness that feels like it's waiting for something to start moving. The observatory was exactly how you'd imagine a forgotten government installation. Concrete bunker, walls, rusted antenna mounts, a broken generator housing crushed by years of snow, but the main dome was intact. And more importantly, the entry code panel had power. I didn't expect that. I tried a series of calibration dates from that 1962 monograph, solstice markers, planetary conjunctions, and on the third attempt, the lock clicked open. After I left the observatory, I told myself I'd take a few days to think, to step back and assess. But I didn't. Instead, I drove straight home, locked the door, and started scanning the documents into an offline archive. I took my phone apart and disabled the Wi-Fi on every device in the house. Not because I believed someone was watching, because I was starting to feel like someone already had been. For weeks there had been little things, static in phone calls, delays in search results, unexplained system reboots that I had chalked up to software updates or aging hardware. Now I wasn't so sure. The file from the observatory included data points, gravitational readings that matched the lensing distortions I'd been tracking, along with times and dates that corresponded to gaps in recorded satellite telemetry, not random blackouts, but missing blocks in data streams, always from the same orbital windows, and always near the same sky region. It was subtle, only noticeable if you were looking at years of archives side by side, which I had been. That alone would have been enough to keep me quiet. But the final page in the folder changed everything. It was a single, typed paragraph, unsigned and undated, titled Contingency Considerations. It listed 3 bullet points. First, public knowledge of artificial lensing may destabilize accepted cosmological models. Second, civilizational myths rooted in sidereal cycles may originate in behavioral response to the structure's emergence. And third, if the visibility threshold is crossed, initiate narrative redirection via partner institutions, astronomy, defense, entertainment. I read that last line 10 times. Narrative redirection. That wasn't science. That was strategy. That was the language of control. I didn't sleep that night. I left the lights off and sat in my hallway, where no windows could silhouette me against glass. I started noticing things. A parked car down the street with fogged windows for hours. A drone that passed overhead twice within 15 minutes. Too low and too slow for commercial use. I wasn't trained in counter-surveillance, but I knew enough to recognize when someone was checking if I'd taken the bait. The next morning, I packed the documents into a plain envelope and drove 4 hours to an old friend, Rena, a systems analyst who used to work on satellite signal cleanup for NOAA before she left over a contract dispute that always sounded more like a forced exit. She owed me nothing, but she agreed to take a look. I told her only what she needed to know, enough to raise a flag without dragging her into it. She read silently for 10 minutes, then looked up and said, "You know they've been modeling this for decades, right?" I asked who. She just shook her head. "It's never who you think." I left the envelope with her and told her to destroy it if anything happened to me. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. No greeting. No name. Just coordinates, identical to those from the old Serpentarius region, followed by 2 words, "Visible soon." I arrived at the coordinates just before dawn. They pointed to a clearing at the edge of an old, defunct radio array on federal land near the Utah border, the kind of place nobody bothers to monitor anymore because it already looks abandoned. The fence was rusted through in several places, and the satellite dishes, dozens of them, stood frozen in odd directions like they'd been interrupted mid-movement decades ago. I didn't know what I was expecting. A signal, maybe. A flare of light. Proof that something in the sky was responding. What I found instead was a structure, not large, not towering, but deliberate. about the size of a utility shed built into the slope of a ridge, its surface matte, black and smooth, absorbing morning light instead of reflecting it. There were no markings, no panels, just a door with no handle, flush with the surface. As I stepped closer, I felt the air shift, not in temperature or pressure, but tone, like I'd walked into the edge of a field that wasn't supposed to exist. My ears rang faintly, not painfully, more like the afterimage of a sound that had already stopped. I reached for my phone to document it, but the screen stayed black. Dead battery. Except it wasn't. When I held it up to my ear, I could hear it vibrating faintly in a slow, rhythmic pulse. 4 beats, pause, 4 beats. It matched the same sequence found in the lensing pattern from the observatory documents. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how silent everything was. No wind, no birds, no background hum of distant roadways. It wasn't just that the world was quiet, it was as if the space around me was actively dampening sound. I circled the structure once, scanning for seams or vents, anything. On the far side, I found what looked like a maintenance panel. When I brushed my hand across it, the surface shimmered faintly, revealing a grid of faint geometric indentations, 12 glyphs, each matching symbols I'd seen on ancient Babylonian star calendars, and above them a 13th, the same one from the redacted NATO file. It wasn't part of any known alphabet, just a coiled line looping back into itself like a serpent eating its own tail. I pressed it without thinking. The hum stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the panel slid open, revealing a hollow compartment lined with a material I couldn't identify. Too dark for metal, too smooth for stone. Inside sat a single object, a mirrored lens, palm-sized, with a dull pulse coming from within, like it was breathing. When I picked it up, everything around me went silent, completely. The sound of my own breathing disappeared. The wind stopped touching my skin, and then I heard it, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper. A voice, or something like one. Not speaking words, but meaning, a feeling embedded into the stillness itself. It is not returning. It is re-emerging. Then everything snapped. Back, the air, the sound, the light. I staggered back and nearly dropped the lens. When I looked up, the sky had changed. Just above the horizon, barely visible, a curve, faint but undeniable, had appeared. Not a cloud, not a halo, a shape.
Fixed, silent, and very slowly growing. I didn't go home after that.
I drove for hours in silence, unsure of where I was going or what I'd do with what I'd seen. The lens sat in the glove compartment, wrapped in an old sweatshirt, still warm to the touch. I hadn't slept in almost 2 days. My thoughts looped, in slow spirals, not panicked, just numb. That curve on the horizon had been there the next morning too, still faint, still easy to miss if you weren't looking. But I was looking, and now I couldn't stop. News outlets hadn't said a word, no mention of new celestial bodies or atmospheric distortion. But I noticed changes in the language, subtle reframing, a few headlines floating vague concerns about satellite drift or misaligned sensors in some weather systems. Quiet, technical, the kind of narrative redirection I now understood. Rena never called me back. I waited 3 days before driving to her apartment. Her place had been cleared out, not ransacked, just empty. No signs of a struggle, no digital trail. Her voicemail still played, but her number no longer connected. I didn't need confirmation to know what had happened. She'd gotten too close to something someone didn't want to understand. I thought about going public, writing everything down, publishing anonymously, but the truth is no one would believe it, not fully, not yet. The story would get dismissed, fact-checked into oblivion, drowned in algorithmic noise. They don't need to erase the truth anymore. They just have to bury it under 1,000 louder lies. So I did something I never expected. I stopped chasing it. I moved east, changed my name, took a job at a community college, teaching basic astronomy to kids who only cared about phone cameras and supermoons. I kept the lens locked away, though I still take it out sometimes, just to feel that pulse. A reminder that something's still out there, waiting. The curve in the sky never fully disappeared. Some nights it vanishes from view entirely. Other nights, when the air is still and the stars are sharp, it returns, faint but fixed, always in the same position, slowly resolving like a picture coming into focus. Whatever it isn't moving. We are. And maybe that's the point. It was never a constellation. It was a boundary, a marker, a warning, or maybe a gate. I'm not afraid anymore, just aware that history isn't written in books. It's carved into the space between stars, in stories that repeat themselves until someone finally listens. I was never meant to find the 13th zodiac, but I did. And even if no one believes me, even if the world pretends it doesn't see what's rising just above the horizon, I know it's there. Because now, when I look at the night sky, I don't see wonder. I see memories. The crystal didn't just glow, it hummed in perfect fifths, and none of our equipment could explain how. I didn't go to Petra looking for anything extraordinary. I was just tagging along with a small team of academic archaeologists for a 3-week survey, part of a heritage conservation effort. Nothing glamorous, just ground-penetrating radar, digital mapping, and documentation. Our group had camped at the edge of the SIQ, the narrow canyon that leads into the ancient city. During the second week, we focused on a lesser-known Nabatean chamber halfway up a crumbling cliff wall. It hadn't been properly explored since the 1980s, and even then, only briefly. The chamber itself was unremarkable, carved out of soft sandstone, roughly rectangular, with soot-stained walls and fragments of pottery. We were wrapping up for the day when Matteo, the youngest in our group, called me over to a section of the floor. His voice was calm, but his face had that careful neutrality people use when something's wrong. Beneath a thin layer of dust and debris was a crack in the stone, perfectly straight, almost invisible until the light hit it at the right angle. When I pressed my ear to it, I heard something. Not quite a sound. More like a vibration, low and steady, pulsing like breath. The team wrote it off as structural stress, maybe heat expansion. I wasn't so sure. That night, after everyone turned in, I went back alone. The desert was silent, stars sharp overhead. I climbed into the chamber and sat there in the dark, listening. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time. Tones, soft and resonant, harmonizing in intervals of fifths, not random, not wind. And then, very faintly, I felt warmth through the stone. It was like the vibration wasn't just passing through, it was coming from below. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my tent with my eyes open, replaying that sound in my mind, trying to rationalize it. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just a weird, acoustic anomaly, some natural quirk of the rock. But then the readings from our magnetometer started acting up. Fluctuations right over the same spot. It was subtle, almost dismissible, but something was there, something we weren't meant to find. The next morning, I kept quiet. I didn't want to spook the team with half-baked theories or strange vibrations only I had felt. Instead, I focused on the data. Our equipment, especially the ground-penetrating radar, was logging inconsistencies, shallow returns where there should have been solid bedrock. I asked Nadia, our tech lead, to recalibrate the GPR for a deeper sweep of the chamber floor. She shrugged but ran it anyway. The scan produced a curious shape, a faint ovoid void just a few meters beneath the surface, like a pocket of open air embedded in the sandstone. It wasn't natural, not at that depth, not in that formation. That night, back at camp, I stayed behind while the others hiked out to signal back results. We had no cell reception in the valley, just one satellite link from a laptop we rotated. Alone, I loaded the raw scan data and began filtering noise, adjusting resolution, and amplifying minor anomalies. What emerged looked eerily symmetrical. A shape, long and tapering, with a rounded tip and faint spokes or channels radiating from its base. I cross-referenced the coordinates with older excavation maps, but nothing in the official records showed any known structures below that area. Out of habit, I uploaded the rendered image to a private academic network I'd used for years, just to check if anything similar existed in archives. Within minutes, I got flagged. Not a reply, an auto-warning that access to a set of restricted geophysical models had been attempted from my account. I hadn't touched those files. I stared at the message, a knot forming in my stomach. Then my inbox blinked. An anonymous message, no subject, no greeting. Just a single sentence. You're
Not the first to find it. I logged off immediately.
The desert air outside the tent was cooling fast, and the night sky looked too still. For the first time, I felt something unfamiliar here, something watching. I went back to the chamber before dawn. The air was dead quiet, the kind of silence that's thicker than sound. I placed a basic contact mic on the stone crack. The vibration was still there, steady, exact, unwavering. I recorded 5 minutes of audio, ran it through a basic frequency analysis, and froze. It wasn't just a hum. The signal contained harmonic overtones, stacked in precise intervals, like a tuning fork struck in a quiet room. And all of it was centered around one frequency, 432 Hz. The so-called pure tone, some claim, resonates with Earth's natural frequency. I didn't believe that kind of thing. At least, I hadn't. I didn't tell the others about the frequency or the message, or the fact that someone out there already knew what we'd stumbled onto. I kept my head down and worked, but my focus shifted. During our scheduled breaks, I visited the archive tent, scanning old excavation records and regional geological surveys. Nothing pointed to a cavity beneath that chamber, yet the void was real, the vibration persistent. I even reached out discreetly to a friend back in Ammon who once worked on seismic modeling for oil prospecting. I sent him a cropped scan, just enough to show the anomaly, nothing else. He called me back within an hour, speaking low and fast. "Whatever that is," he said, "it's not geological, and it's not old." That stuck with me, not old. I started pulling at threads late into the night, using the limited connection to dig through declassified seismic reports and post-colonial survey maps. In the margins of a British report from the 1920s, I found a handwritten note about tonal anomalies recorded near Petra, dismissed as instrument failure. In another document from the 1960s, a French geophysicist briefly mentioned underground harmonics of unknown origin during a regional fault line assessment. Both were in the exact same area we were working. I traced the coordinates and overlaid them onto our modern satellite data. They lined up precisely. It wasn't a coincidence. It was repetition. I felt something shift in me that night, like a quiet permission to stop doubting what I already knew. The crystal, if that's what it was, had been resonating for decades, maybe centuries. And then there was the pattern. I extracted the harmonic signature from the recording and broke it into segments, each segment repeated at exact intervals. I ran it through a basic frequency visualizer, and what appeared wasn't random, it was geometric. Clean shapes, nested inside one another, rotating like parts of a clock. I cross-checked the frequency ratios and found something that pulled the breath out of me. They matched the harmonic structure of ancient Sumerian tuning systems, perfect fifths, pure octaves, no accident. Whoever, or whatever, placed this thing beneath Petra had tuned it to resonate with the earth itself. I looked at the chamber floor, now just dusty stone again, and felt something shift behind it. Not physically, but in my understanding. This wasn't just buried history, it was placed, intentionally, for a reason. 2 days later, I made a decision I didn't tell anyone about. Our team had mapped all official access tunnels and chambers, but there was one narrow crevice along the eastern ridge, just outside the survey boundary, that no one had paid attention to. Locals called it the Shepherd's Cut, barely a metre wide at its base and blocked off by a rusted grate that looked like it had been there since the Ottoman period. No one knew why it had been sealed. That afternoon, while the others catalogued pottery shards in the main tent, I hiked out alone with a headlamp, gloves, and a bolt cutter borrowed under false pretenses. The grate gave way with a groan of metal, and I slipped through, ducking, under hanging rock and stepping cautiously into the narrow passage. It smelled of dust and dry earth, untouched for decades. After 20 meters, the walls widened just enough for me to move upright. And that's when I saw the carvings. They weren't like the Nabatean inscriptions scattered across Petra. These were deeper, smoother, almost machine-cut, spirals, lines, and repeating symbols that matched the shapes I'd extracted from the audio spectrogram. I traced them with my fingers, noting how cool the stone felt, almost colder than the air. The further I went, the more distinct the markings became. Eventually I reached a dead end, a blank stone wall smooth as glass. At its center, embedded in the rock, was a thin vertical slit, maybe 3 inches wide and just deep enough for a hand. I hesitated. The air in the chamber had gone still, as if the wind had been pulled out of the world. Without thinking, I reached into the slit. My fingers brushed something. It vibrated, not a mechanical vibration, but a warm, harmonic hum that travelled up my arm and settled behind my eyes. I yanked my hand back, heart racing, stumbling into the wall behind me. Nothing had moved, and yet the chamber felt different, like something unseen had shifted. I backed out slowly, retracing my steps until I saw daylight again. The grate was still there, leaning open like a held breath. Back at camp, I said nothing. But that night, the vibrations in the chamber floor were louder, more distinct. I placed my mic again, pressed my headphones close, and realized something I hadn't before. The tone was rising, slightly, subtly, like it was responding. By the end of the third week, the rest of the team had started to notice the anomalies too, though no one wanted to say it outright. Nadia casually mentioned that her magnetometer readings were behaving weird again, and Matteo joked about the ghost tones our audio sensors had begun picking up. I laughed along, but inside I was spiraling. I'd been up late every night, scrubbing data, filtering frequencies, trying to convince myself this was just geology, just some unexplained mineral resonance or fault line vibration. But I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Something under Petra was activating. And I wasn't the only one who knew. The anonymous messages continued. At first it was a second email, then a third. "Stop broadcasting the signal," one read. Another said simply, "It's not yours to wake." I hadn't shared the audio files, not beyond the analysis I'd done offline, so I couldn't understand how anyone could have known. Unless they were already monitoring the site. I started checking for signs, equipment tampering, traces of
new footprints around the shepherd's cut, strange sounds during the night shift, but everything stayed just subtle enough to dismiss.
And that made it worse. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly. Every time someone stepped behind me at the workstation, I tensed. When a drone flyover was rerouted by our coordinator without explanation, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had intercepted our location logs. I tried talking to Nadia after dinner one night, tentatively, carefully. But as soon as I mentioned the frequency shift, she shut down, eyes cautious, voice suddenly distant. "We should stick to what we can measure," she said, and that was the end of it. The following morning, one of our backup hard drives was missing. Not stolen, just gone, like it had never been packed. Our lead archaeologist wrote it off as field chaos, but I knew better. I'd catalogued that drive myself. That night I hiked back to the shepherd's cut, only this time I wasn't alone. At the ridge, barely visible against the rock, were fresh boot prints, deep ones, military tread, recent. I turned off my headlamp and crouched low, waiting, listening. Nothing. No voices, no movement. Just the hum beneath my feet, steady and rising. I realized then that it wasn't just a discovery anymore. It was a threshold, and crossing it meant someone would try to stop us. The breakthrough didn't happen with a bang. It was quiet, almost surgical. On the final scheduled day of our expedition, just after sunrise, a sandstorm rolled through the valley without warning. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and we were ordered to shelter in place. But when the storm passed 2 hours later, a new path had revealed itself, an exposed shelf just below the shepherd's cut, where centuries of erosion had concealed a narrow vertical fissure. I didn't wait for permission. I grabbed my field kit, left a vague excuse, and descended the ledge alone. The fissure was just wide enough to slide through sideways, my shoulders scraping stone as I inched down into the dark. After maybe 20 feet, the shaft opened into a chamber, low and circular, the walls covered in that same impossible geometry I'd seen in the abandoned tunnel. At the center was a pedestal, not carved but grown like cooled volcanic glass, but smoother, reflective, and pulsing faintly with blue light. And on top of it sat the crystal. Not large, maybe the size of a grapefruit, but perfectly symmetrical, faceted like no natural mineral I'd ever seen. It glowed from within, its light shifting in rhythm, and when I stepped closer I heard it again. Those perfect fifths, layered and harmonic, vibrating not just in the air, but inside my body. I reached out, hand trembling, and the moment my fingers hovered over its surface, the chamber changed. The walls brightened with hidden symbols, lighting up in sequence like a circuit board coming online. My field recorder, still clipped to my pack, began capturing data so fast the buffer overflowed, and then came the tone, sharp, high, clean, like a tuning fork struck against the earth's core. The sound knocked me backward, but I wasn't hurt. In fact, I felt calm. A clarity I hadn't known I was missing settled over me. At that moment, I understood. This wasn't a relic, it was a device, a planetary instrument designed not to send a signal outward, but inward, into the crust, into the core, as if tuning something inside the Earth itself. When I surfaced, everything felt off. The team was tense, distracted. A military helicopter had been seen circling to the west. Our coordinator was on a sat phone, speaking in clipped phrases, clearly not about logistics. Later that night, our entire data set, months of work, was wiped from the system. No trace, no backups. The only thing that remained was the recording, still hidden in the micro drive, sewn into the lining of my field jacket. That's when I knew I couldn't go back. I had touched something ancient and still alive. And now it has touched me. It's been 6 months since Petra. I don't use my real name anymore, and I haven't stayed in one place longer than 10 days. The data I salvaged, the recording, the harmonic sequence, the resonance maps, I've made copies, encrypted them, and sent them to people who might understand what it means. Most don't respond, a few did, but not the way I hoped. One physicist told me I was describing a resonance field that shouldn't exist outside a vacuum. Another suggested what I'd found might be a type of signal amplification not designed for communication, but for synchronization, planetary synchronization. I'm no longer interested in proving anything. I've stopped trying to convince people. The truth doesn't need consensus. Since that last day in the chamber, something has changed in me, not metaphorically, but physically. I hear it when I sleep, low tones beneath the surface of the world, rising and falling like breath. Sometimes, when I hold still, I feel my bones respond like they're aligning with something larger than me. It's subtle, but constant. I've had blood work done anonymously at clinics across 4 countries. Always the same anomaly: elevated electromagnetic sensitivity, irregular neural rhythms, and, in one test, a presence of an unidentified trace mineral in the soft tissue.
Of my hands, they didn't have a name for it. I didn't offer one. I think the crystal marked me, not in a way visible to the eye, but in frequency. Whatever it was designed to do, I triggered it. Or maybe I was just there when it woke up.
I've replayed that moment 1,000 times. The pedestal, the light, the hum rising around me like a chord resolving after centuries of silence. It wasn't technology the way we define it. It functioned through resonance, intention, without interface. It had no wires, no language, no warning labels, just vibration waiting to be aligned. And now that it has, I believe we're already inside the mechanism. The planet isn't just a host, it's part of a system, maybe even the system itself. I used to think archaeology was about uncovering the past. Now I think it's about listening to what's still running. The crystal didn't reveal the future. It reminded the earth what key it was tuned to. And now that tone is rising, slowly, steadily, as if whatever built it is waiting for the song to begin again.